Hi everyone, my name is Justine and it's a pleasure to be moderating this discussion today. I'd like to introduce our panellists. First we have Peter Furness, who started the Australian Marriage Equality Lobby in 2004 and who is a same-sex marriage activist. We also have Patricia Werricoon, who for a number of years directed the graduate program in sexual health at Sydney University. She's very keen on talking about sex and is happy to share those insights with us here today. And lastly, we have Ian Powell, who works for the City Bible Forum and is an Anglican minister. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this forum. Now, I'm sure you're aware that the issue of same-sex marriage is very prominent and hotly debated in Australia at the moment. Julia Gillard has allowed for a conscience vote for the Labor Party, and Barry O'Farrell has allowed one for the New South Wales Liberal Party as well. Same-sex marriage has been legalised in a number of countries, including the Netherlands, Belgium, Spain, Canada, South Africa, Sweden, Argentina. I could go on. It's hotly debated in the UK and the US. And according to media reports, Julia Gillard has said that it's a matter of time before same-sex marriage is legal in Australia. Of course, we had the Mardi Gras as well on Saturday, and the Sydney Morning Herald reported after that event that equality was the message of the Mardi Gras. Robert, a parade participant, said they need to actually make marriage equality for everybody. It's how it should be. So in this context, the opposition of some Christians to the issue of same-sex marriage puts mainstream Christians, I suppose, out of step with the rest of Australia, because polls have indicated that as many as 60% of Australians support same-sex marriage. So this is the context that we're debating and talking about today, and as I'm sure you can appreciate, it's a very controversial, very fraught topic. So I'd like to emphasise that today we are having a discussion. Okay? It's about sharing ideas and listening to each other, and I hope that all of the questions and comments and our interactions can be governed by that spirit of generosity. So in light of that, let's kick off. Peter, I have the first question for you. So as I've said, there's opposition to same-sex marriage in various Christian circles. Firstly, how do you respond to that opposition? And in light of that, would you think that Jesus would have gone to the Mardi Gras?
I think I've seen Jesus at Mardi Gras several times, actually. In fact, there are quite a few religious groups who do go to Mardi Gras. There's various religious denominations. There's Catholic acceptance. There's gay Anglicans, other denominations. There's gay Jews. There's gay Muslims. I should say I'm not a person of religious faith, so I don't really know the answer to that question. Religion is something that people create, in my view. So I would like to think, or my memory of Jesus as a young person is that he was an inclusive sort of person. He mixed with all sorts, petty thieves, prostitutes. I can't see why he wouldn't go to Mardi Gras. But really, that's an issue for Christians to decide. If you have that belief, then you decide what type of God you believe in. It's not really for someone who doesn't have a religious belief to say.
Okay, thank you. So we'll just hand that over to Ian then. So Ian, there was an article in the Sydney Morning Herald last week, "I Hugged a Man in His Underwear." That's the title. Now, basically this was about how Christians had gone to the Chicago Pride Parade, which is equivalent to Sydney's Mardi Gras, and they held up posters and wore t-shirts that essentially said, "I'm sorry for the way Christians have treated you." So the writer ended up being hugged by a man who was participating in the parade and who saw his poster and was moved by it. So he writes in his article, "I think Jesus would have hugged him too." So what do you think? Would Jesus have gone to the Mardi Gras and would he have hugged this guy as well?
Yeah, thanks. At one level I agree with Peter's leaving a question mark over what Jesus would do, but for different reasons. I think he's not under my control, although he's a symbol of what people tend to believe. People have stuff they think is good, they believe Jesus is good, so they assume that whatever they think is good, Jesus will think. So he is, when I began to get to know Jesus myself, reading the Gospels, he is full of unexpected things. But I was there on the weekend, and there were a group of 5 Chinese Christians holding similar posters, not saying anything, just smiling at the magnificently regaled people getting onto the floats with some had "Jesus loves you," a poster saying "I'm sorry," and John 3:16. And would Jesus go there? I mean, he probably spend time with bankers, so I can't see why he wouldn't spend time with anyone else in our community. So I would think he may Yeah, I see no reason not to think. And would he hug a gay guy? Absolutely.
Patricia, to a layperson, sexual orientation appears to be quite clear-cut. You're either gay or you're straight. What does your research tell us about that?
Actually, the research says that gender as it is a lot broader than just sexual orientation. We talk of biological sex, which is basically the anatomy. And as we know, I mean, we are created wonderfully and our genitals are just so beautiful, but we won't go in there. They're just a complementarity of male and female. Then, of course, there is what we call gender identity, which is like if I walk up to one of you and say, are you a male or a female? You're going to be very sure that whether you're male or female, and that starts when you're about 2 years old. Unfortunately, we do have problems there, and we have transsexuals and transgender. And then we have the whole sexual orientation and sex roles or behavior. Now, even when it comes to sexual orientation, it isn't just black and white, them and us, heterosexual, homosexual. There is this whole spectrum between somebody who's homosexual by nature and by behavior. So there is a trait of I am homosexual as well as behavior, and then there is the heterosexual by nature and behavior. And then there is this whole spectrum of people who would vary between what they fantasize, or maybe there are some people, one of my students did a PhD on what he called fluid sexuality, which is men who are in heterosexual marriages and still have homosexual activities. So there is a whole spectrum.
I can see why people opt for the clear-cut definition, because that's quite confusing. It seems like a bit of a minefield. And we will be talking about matters of identity a little bit later on in this forum. But Peter, if I can just ask you, because we are looking at the idea of same-sex marriage, among other things, can you tell us how the gay community defines marriage?
Well, I think views of what marriage is in the gay community is as diverse as it is within the broader community. I can tell you what my view of marriage is and why I married. I was in a relationship for 13 years and then decided to marry my partner, having attended a wedding in Vancouver conducted by the Anglican Diocese of Westminster in Vancouver, which allows their ministers to marry same-sex couples. And I was particularly moved by that experience and wanted to I guess, make that gift to my partner. I wanted to make my partner, or give my partner that same status. Generally, when you're marrying, your intention is to marry once. Of course, people sometimes, divorce and so on. I wanted to give that status to my partner, Theo, and thankfully he wanted to give that status to me. So in that sense, it was a very private thing. Of course, when you go and you tell your mother or your work colleagues or anybody else you're getting married, it becomes something other than a private thing. People want to give you gifts, people want to celebrate, and it has always other greater, larger meaning. I think in the gay community, generally, we have found a lot of people, perhaps the older people, find that marriage is a patriarchal, old-fashioned institution, unequal. It's about men controlling women. They can't see the point of it. It's something you might want to get away from. Why would you want to copy heterosexuals and get married? Generally, younger people are much more in favour of marriage. They view it as an equal institution. It's about love and commitment and support for each other, and it has a lot more appeal. And I actually think that's probably reflective also of the broader community. I think marriage is having a bit of a resurgence.
Yeah, I think you'd be right in that. Ian, can I throw to you? Peter's just commented how, in his mind, marriage is an offers a relationship of equality, and it's about love and commitment. So, can you use that basically, and talk about how the Christian definition of marriage meets those points and perhaps departs from them?
Yes, I'm a little confused on how to answer that, because there are sort of two related questions for me as a Christian in Australia. That is, using the word Christian to mean in a sort of classical sense, I understand Jesus is not lying when he says he's the Son of God, and so I believe him, therefore I believe he is the expert on all areas, God, sexuality, the whole box and dice. And I have certain views of marriage that come from him, and which I don't think Jesus gives any grounds for attempting to enforce that on the broader community. We're not engaged as Christians in trying to set up a theocracy. But as a citizen of Australia, I've got every right to argue my understanding of marriage with this, in our community. And I think the issue is kind of it's a legislative thing, because when the Marriage Act says, and I've just got it here, it's not long, but I think it's helpful to see what the argument is about changing the legislation so that gays can be equally included in marriage. Here's the present definition from the Australian law. Marriage is the union of a man and a woman to the exclusion of all others, voluntarily entered into for life. And interestingly in that, there's not a mention of love. Because one of our problems, I think, is in talking about marriage is, I think our society has been for decades a bit confused about what marriage is. And I think it's been Disneyfied, I think it's been Hollywoodized. It's purely about my affection and attraction to another person. Whereas around the world, I think it's fair to say, almost through all recorded history in almost every single culture that we know, there's a structure which we call marriage. It's got slight cultural differences. So I was watching the other day with a friend a documentary on nomads in Mongolia, and they were visiting these big tent things, and what you had was mum, dad and the kids. And Mongolia is about as far away from a Christianised European sort of picture we might have. There's something humans have just done in almost every tribe in almost throughout history. And what the Marriage Act simply says, it recognises that. And it says because that becomes the basis in the end of children, we privilege that. And it's man and woman in a lifelong exclusionary relationship. Is it about love? Yes, certainly as a Christian I would think everything's about love. But that's the question, should that be changed? Because when you ask for equality, who can vote against equality? Anyone here against equality? Anyone here against love? See, I feel, I've only been engaged in this discussion for 2 days. I mean, Peter's is much more experienced in it, but I just think it's been brilliantly framed by the gay community. Who can possibly argue against equality and love? But I just think it's a deeper thing. Marriage has a deeper role in human ecology. And can you mess with it? Yes. Might we find that, like natural ecology, if you mess with it, it has unforeseen consequences? And that's my concern, that we really are rushing into this fairly quickly. A couple of decades might seem a long time for people to wait, but in terms of human civilization, thousands of years, thousands of cultures, I'd just like us to reflect a bit more on what marriage really is. It's not just about being in love.
Yeah, you've raised a lot of points there, Ian, but I'm going to go first to Patricia. Do you want to respond to anything that Ian has said, and also talk about whether the research points to a best model, so-called,
Okay, well,
marriage?
Couple of things. One is I'd like to just speak as a sexologist. Sexologists basically study sex. So that's what we are. Now, in terms of studying sex and marriage, it's really fascinating because recent research on brain has shown us that what's the chemistry behind falling in love and making commitment. And we find that, the process of falling in love is like bringing all this energy of your sexual desire to be focused on one person. And then when you are with that person for some time, which we call marriage, man and woman, in that process you have chemicals like, things called oxytocin and vasopressin, which we call the cuddle hormones. And the more you are together and the more sex you have, the more bonded and the more committed you are. As a Christian, I really feel that that's like our created, bringing together in one flesh and letting us stay together. So that's one sort of research almost, I won't say evidence, but I guess it kind of supports that we are created for commitment. The other thing which always fascinates me is I'm originally from Sri Lanka, and I would have worn my sari except that it's such a rainy day. And so, I come from a culture where like 60% or so are still arranged marriages. And so you go into marriage because two people are considered compatible, and then they fall in love. And when I look at the gay marriage issue, I often think, would gay men or lesbian women go in for an arranged marriage where commitment is more important than desire and love?
Do you want to answer that?
I can't see myself going in for an arranged marriage, but I certainly have some friends who need some help and perhaps could benefit from that arrangement. I just like to respond just generally to Ian's comments that marriage is designed perhaps for bringing children into the world. There are many same-sex couples who, for one reason or another, have children or are responsible for raising children. And we know from research, I hate saying from research, but I've said it, that the children of married parents tend to fare better than the children of unmarried parents or single parents. It may not be as a consequence of marriage, but that's the research. Those children of same-sex parents deserve the same benefits, the same stability, the same security, the same status that comes from having married parents as any other Australian child deserves. Concern for the welfare of children is an argument for same-sex marriage. It is definitely not an argument against same-sex marriage. And at the risk of being impolite, because Christians will often bring up the issue, people who call themselves Christian will often bring up the issue of the welfare of children. And it does seem to us to be a little bit rich for Christians to be pointing at the finger at gays and lesbians in respect of the welfare of children. So I just wanted to raise that point. Yeah.
I saw Patricia, I think she wants to say something about, because you're arguing essentially that children do better in a married context.
Well, the research has done that, and for shown that, and for just very basic reasons. And it may have to do with two people who are going to have children or have children for some other reason, and think about their relationship and then want to enter into a marriage. You know, there's some more stability there.
Okay, Patricia, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I'll just respond very quickly. And that, I mean, I love to say that from research. I mean, research does indicate, and I do talk a lot to teens, young children, like from year 7 up, on sexuality and gender issues. And one of the things we have found is that young children especially need strong role models of male and female in their lives. And a family of mother and father is, we believe, the best model.
Can I ask Peter just a question? When you said that you thought it was a bit rich for Christians, can you just spell it out a bit?
Well, certainly in this country and in many other countries, the track record of some organised religions, you know, Catholic religion and Anglicans, in respect of looking after children, hasn't been that great. It continues to be a very fraught issue around the world, wherever you go. I returned from Chile this week, and in Chile it's a very big issue,
that's just wondering what it was.
as amongst other places. And then, you know, I note that you can make that discussion about children, but in a way you can't raise that without us getting it is a little bit personal.
Yeah, that's fine.
I accept that.
Yeah, I know.
So I think it is worth saying. When people say to us, oh, you're not concerned for the welfare of your children or of children generally, look at those who are pointing the finger and making that claim. But I don't want to get too...
I just wanted to make sure... I don't know if you are anywhere half as furious about what's happened to children in the context of church things, and in the Boy Scouts, and at schools, and anywhere where children are, they've been sexually... And it is disgraceful and unbelievably damaging to the children and secondarily to the reputation of those who said they were looking after them. But to be fair, the Catholics have got the worst of this, but 99% of Catholic priests are not pedophiles, but the 1% have done huge damage. But I'm not suggesting, like with Peter's point, I think if you've got, through the various brokenness of our culture, children who are being cared for by perhaps one gay person and then they partner up with someone, there are all sorts of ways in which the needs for those two caring adults to have access to care for the child could be and should be looked after. And also for the one, if they get children, that if the relationship breaks down, that the access to the child is kept. That, I think, there's no doubt that can be done with completely other legal structures than by it's not a question of making marriage more equal. It really is a question of changing marriage. That's what it is. We've got to be, I think, blunt about what it is. So the needs you say about the parents are absolutely right, and I agree. But that can be met and has been met in a number of jurisdictions by civil unions and other things like that. So I think the kids can be cared for and should be cared for in other ways, apart from...
So
tearing apart
when the child is asked in school, are your parents married? No, they're civilly registered or they're civilly unioned, or no, they're not married, basically.
But there's all sorts of people who've got de facto parents whose parents,
yes,
so it's a common enough thing, sadly. I mean, Christians have got as much, if not more, trouble with the way in which our culture has embraced de facto relationships. It's not as if we think marriage is fantastic, except for this change. We've been in a very radically challenging position with our culture's view of marriage for many, many decades.
Let me just bring up the point, you mentioned about the changes to the definition of marriage, and I think we should talk about this because it's come up in previous forums as well. Let's talk about the slippery slope argument that once you extend marriage rights to gay couples, then other groups can come forward and say that as well. There's an argument put forward by writer Stanley Kurtz that if every sexual orientation has a right to construct its own form of marriage, then more changes are surely due. For what gay marriage is to homosexuality, group marriage is to bisexuality. So obviously this comes up, Peter, I'm sure. Do you want to respond to that? You know, should marriage rights be extended not only to gay identified people, but to bisexual people as well?
Well, I think someone who's bisexual or transgendered or intersex, if people should be able to marry. And there is no push in Australia to extend marriage beyond two people. That's quite clear. There are a number of countries in the world where polygamous marriage is permitted. All those countries are Islamic countries, and they operate with an Islamic or Sharia law principle. There are a number of countries which permit two people of the same sex to marry and have for a number of years, and in none of those countries is polygamous marriage permitted or likely to be. Those things are quite opposite things. That same argument about a slippery slope occurred when in Australia, previously in 2 states, Aborigines, for instance, had restrictions on being able to marry. In Queensland, if you were an Aborigine, you had to apply to the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs to marry, and you would only be granted approval if you were marrying another Aborigine. In Western Australia, the same system applied, but you would be only granted approval if you were marrying a non-Aborigine. In Queensland, they sought to keep the race pure. In Western Australia, they sought to breed the race out. Now, that is an offensive notion, and it's now being passed. Similarly, in the United States, not so long ago, people of different races were not allowed to marry. Those laws have since been overturned. In defence of those laws in Australia and the US, people would argue, if you allow interracial marriage, what next? People will want to marry people of the same sex. People will want to marry their dog or their favourite car, what have you. It's a nonsense. If you say one change always leads to a worse change, then we would not have changed anything.
I think Ian wants to respond.
The slippery slope argument that you brought up really has to be taken very carefully because it can be used to stop any change. We can't go to dollars and cents because I don't know what the slippery slope, but you can use it to oppose anything. Yeah. I disagree with Peter when he says no one is arguing this. I just think that's not accurate. No one maybe in the gay and lesbian community is, but I never get this word right. Polyamory community were upset that they felt excluded from this Mardi Gras because they wanted to argue that multiple partners was a legitimate place in the new order of marriage. Once equality becomes the basis of marriage and love in a personal affection, rather than the standard, that's what marriage seems to be around the world, let's protect it and give it certain benefits because it often brings up kids. It's just not true to say that the slippery slide argument is just a theoretical argument. It's happening in Australia. Some parts of the community have said quite happily, good, we'll be glad when this comes because we will argue for multiple marriages, etc. In Switzerland, this is an extreme case, but Switzerland, which is ahead of us in this game in some areas, there's been an argument in 2010 before their parliament to remove the barriers against incest because two adults who love each other, whether they be brother, sister, mother, son, whatever, if they're consenting adults who take the pill so no deformed children will be born, there is no reason on the basis of love and equality to exclude it. So I agree with Peter that Peter's friends might not, but it's not a theoretical question, the slippery slide. It is being argued, and I take it the reason why the polyamory community went quiet was because they knew it would damage the gay and lesbian agenda, because if the community is asked to think, my problem I think for Australia is the position that I'm arguing, which feels terribly conservative and I don't like being in that position, But it's asking people to think rather than to just feel with people who feel a bit deprived in their love life, and asking people to think about community, not individual, long-term results to a society rather than here's a happy picture of people getting married. And I think, but the slippery slope is a real, provable, unavoidable thing once you change the nature of marriage to a question of love and equality. You cannot stop that argument.
Switzerland is, I would say, behind Australia. No same-sex marriage in Switzerland, not even civil unions. They do have a system of registered partnerships, which is a mechanism for extending some rights to same-sex couples with the least possible status. Perhaps the system you approve of. But Switzerland certainly isn't ahead of the game in Australia in terms of same-sex marriage.
I'm simply saying that there are all sorts of people who want to use love and equality as the grounds to have what would seem unthinkable to be a human right in the end. Each
of those demands should be looked at individually. For example, in the Marriage Act, there are restrictions. You can't marry a close family relation. They stipulate who you can and can't marry. You can't marry a sibling, a daughter, a parent, or a grandparent, etc. There's restrictions on age.
Yeah.
Now, there's a public good for those restrictions existing, I think, which is quite obvious. You don't want 12-year-olds marrying, although there are some people in our community who would have 12-year-olds be able to marry.
Yes.
You don't want brothers and sisters marrying. There's a quite obvious public good. I cannot see the public good for having my country refuse to recognise my marriage, which is recognised in a number of other countries. I can't see the public good there.
I'm going to have to rein it in a little bit and give Patricia the right of reply.
Well, I just wanted to just again drop a bit of research in here, I guess, talking about the slippery slope argument. I mean, in the sexology community, you know, this talking about nature, nurture, what is home, is there a gay gene, that is sort of old hat now. And some of the new research is actually looking at something called genetic sexual attraction, and that is like siblings who were separated when they were children, maybe adopted out, and then they meet as adults and they fall in love. And so should they be allowed to get married? And there's looking at, there is a sexual attraction which is genetic in families. And so there is research that sometime soon may actually then support incest. I'm just putting that as research maybe for the future.
Can I ask you, Ian, if there is a genetic sexual attraction inherent in some people, then can you be Christian and gay at the same time? And I should mention that this is a question from the audience. I'm sorry we've been so absorbed in this. But yeah, can you be Christian and gay at the same time? Like, isn't that an unreasonable demand to say you have this predisposition towards this behaviour and yet you are not to live like that as a Christian?
Yes, thank you for that question. In a couple of weeks' time, I'm going to be trying to address that specifically, I think, here, 2 Thursdays' time. But it's partly, and I don't want to play games, it's partly a definitional question. What do you mean by Christian? What do you mean by gay? If you mean I become, I get convinced about who Jesus is, I put my trust in him to forgive my sins and to be the sort of guide and coach in life, and I find I have same-sex attraction. I take it that's what you mean, that my sexual preference is for people of the same sex. Yes, it will mean, as it has meant for a number of my friends, that they will say that unless something changes in the way that my sexual attraction works, I will be celibate. In exactly the same way for people who are heterosexual, who become Christian and stop having sex with their boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever, and will not have sex again unless they finish up in the relationship Jesus speaks about, a man and a woman cleaving together, because that's the only place which God in his terrific wisdom and love says that's where sex lives and breathes beautifully and happily and healthily. So yes, gay people will. It is a tough call, but all sorts of people have very tough calls if they take Jesus seriously, and they find, like my friends who are gay find, it's absolutely worth it.
Can I ask you, Patricia, this is also a question from the audience, what are the health issues for gay people, and perhaps taking into account this experience of feeling, I don't know, not at home within a Christian community for various reasons?
Well, what we know in terms of, again, research, is that depression, mental illness is higher in the gay homosexual community rather than the heterosexual community. And in talking about especially young men, the suicide rates are higher in young men who have got gender variant behavior, and often it's tied in with bullying. And some of the new research that is being done is the increasing rate of anal cancer in gay men. And so there is a fair amount of evidence of increased health problems, concerns in homosexual community.
Do you want to comment on that?
I mean, I guess you'd have to judge this as it being gay inherently unhealthy. I don't know if that was the sort of question you were being asked. Certainly, we have we've gone to some expense to bring an expert out from the USA. I don't know why we did that actually from the USA, but we have, who's talking about the health benefits of marriage, and particularly to gay and lesbian people, and they are the same as it is to people in the heterosexual community. Rightly or wrongly, people who are married tend to have better health outcomes for all sorts of reasons. So again, I can't see why you would then want to deny gay people those benefits for any reason other than being malevolent. So.
Okay, we have another question from the audience. This is for Peter or Ian, but Patricia, I'm sure you can weigh in if you like. The Christian viewpoint wants to impose its view on non-Christians by way of a secular instrument, the law. Is that appropriate? I think Ian already talked about this before.
Yeah, and I think, look, to be fair, some of my Christian brothers and sisters who I have enormous respect for do, in the same way as every group does. I mean, every group takes its view of how life works best and tries to persuade the community that's the way we should go, and there are cultural wars. I mean, there's an argument going on, a fairly potent argument about this question of should the old understanding of marriage be ripped up? It's not good because it's old, and it's not bad because it's old. But should it be torn up and transformed, which is what it would be? And I don't have any, as I've gone back to Jesus and said, what do you think about this? What do I get from your teaching? I see no hint from the Bible that I'm supposed to try and impose my understanding of what is right and best for humans, although I do think that Jesus knows, in the long term, on the rest of the community. There's a line that the Apostle Paul says, much unread and much hated, where he says, it is not my job to judge those outside the church. It's hard enough for Christians to love properly without us, but I think if Christians do that, I think they may be well-intentioned, but they're wrong. And it's not particularly Christian, although it's common enough in our community to try and impose our opinions. And we're part of the democracy, so I've got every right to argue my case, but I don't think I can argue it with my community by simply saying, Jesus says, therefore you should shut up and do what he says. I think I should be able to show why this works. For me, that Jesus says it is plenty enough proof. He's the expert in all these things. But I don't think we should be setting up some sort of theocracy or trying to.
What do you think, Peter?
Well, I mean, I guess if you're a legislator, how you determine, or like the rest of us, what is right and wrong would vary. If I say I'm a person without religious belief, how I determine what is right and wrong or good or bad may be slightly different to Patricia or Ian, or maybe similar in some circumstances. I guess then I'm saying I don't object if a member of Parliament says, well, I'm a Christian, and that informs how I view legislation which comes before me. Nevertheless, many different Christians have different views on this subject. Our organisation is contacted frequently by a large number of ministers of religion who say to us, I would like the right to marry same-sex couples. I'm prohibited under current legislation. Current law doesn't give me that freedom to exercise my religion in accordance with my faith. The amendment you're proposing will enable me to do that. In regards to this legislation, I do object to Christians claiming ownership of the institution of marriage. Marriage existed long before Christianity, long before Judaism, in various cultures. So it's not a Christian institution. My memory of the Bible is that Jesus came upon a wedding, and his first miracle he ever performed, which may seem a little bit flippant, turning water into wine. He came along and helped a party to exist.
And gallons of it.
So, but in regards to legislation, this definition contained in the Marriage Act was put in 2004 as an amendment, which talks about a man and a woman. It wasn't there when the Act was established in 1961 under the Menzies.
That was the quote from the 61 Act.
Yeah, no, that's the 2004.
No, that was the 60.
In 1961, that man and woman reference was not there. And when the Attorney General moved the bill, a backbencher from Menzies' own Liberal Party moved an amendment to insert that reference, and the Attorney General rejected the amendment, saying this, that our understanding of what marriage is now may change. And they therefore didn't put that reference in.
Ian, I agree with him that marriage is not a Christian institution. Right, okay. I agree with that. It's part of the whole creation.
But do Christians own marriage?
No, God owns marriage. If anyone owns it, God owns all things. It's why we don't like God, because we like to think we're the owners, and he's saying, no, you're in someone else's house.
Okay, we have a couple of minutes left, so maybe we'll move into our...
Okay, so I know you've got a couple of minutes left. Most marriages which occur in Australia each year, well over 60%, I should just for people's background, occur outside any religious structure or building, outside of a church or a synagogue. So I think 62% or something like that each year, and it has been for some years. So marriage in Australia is very much a civil institution.
As it should be. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. We're moving to our last questions. Patricia, I'd like to ask you what we should hope for in our sexual lives.
I would love to say we would all hope for holistic, healthy, happy sexual lives. But being in the fallen world we've got a lot of work to go before we can actually get there.
Okay.
I'm very glad Patricia corrected or added to something she said yesterday. And she said that the more sex you have with your partner, you get hormones which bind you together even more. But she added today that cuddling is also included. Because I'm 18 years in a relationship. As you know, things change. So I'm glad.
Don't tell me that. I'm nearly married.
Glad cuddling gives you the same hormones as well.
Okay, so Ian, people love Jesus, but not necessarily Christians, especially when it comes to this debate. So how can Christians live by their faith commitments and still be good friends to people who don't agree with them on certain matters like this?
Yeah, boy, that's a good question. One of the helpful things that was said to me when I was an atheist and looking at religions was draw a sharp distinction between Jesus and Christians, which was kind of helpful. My problem with the question is, in some people's minds, I'm some sort of mad Bible-thumping Christian, but I have quite a number of gay friends. And I just think we may disagree on some things, but I think the whole thing about when I became a Christian, the whole call is to love others as God has loved me. Now, it does not mean that I always agree with them. God has the cheek to often disagree with me. But I think, but to be loving, to listen, to empathise, nothing that I think about marriage or whatever would indicate that gay men and women or transgender or whatever are second-class citizens at all. I just think it's a mistake to change marriage in the name of equality. But I just think what Christians need to do, and sometimes, frankly, we've done a bad job, and I think the worse job we do, the more likely we are to get on the media. But it's all about learning to love, to listen and to care.
Peter, if I can ask you, would the right for same-sex couples to marry represent the end of discrimination for LGBTI individuals?
I think legally in Australia, absolutely yes. In 2009, the Federal Parliament amended 80-odd pieces of legislation to extend practical rights to those in same-sex relationships. It held out only with the Marriage Act, which does attract some practical rights, particularly in respect of immigration, but that's the last legal barrier to equality under the law.
And what about culture? Is it a question for law to implement that, or what do you think about the cultural aspects of that as well?
Well, there's symbolic importance, I think, is fundamentally important. What the law says to you as a gay person, whether you're in a relationship or not, that gay relationships are lesser than other relationships. It sends a very strong message. Australia has a particularly bad record of preventing youth suicide. Young men between 16 and 24 in Australia commit suicide in very large numbers compared to other countries, almost always by hanging themselves. And half of those are said to be related to issues around sexuality. As long as we've got a law telling gay people that you are second class, attitudinal change is not going to happen. I think the symbolism is fundamentally important.
I'm afraid we have to leave it there, even though we've just gotten stuck into the guts of everything. Can I ask all of you to kindly thank our panellists? Thank you very much.
Well, welcome to the forum. Welcome to all those. My name is Russell Matthews. We want to welcome you to today's forum, today's discussion on would Jesus go to the Mardi Gras? And I'm going to just hand it right over to Justine Toe. Justine's our moderator today, and I'll allow her to introduce all the panelists for you. Thanks so much for being here today, and enjoy.
Thank you, Russ. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Justine, and it's a pleasure to be moderating this discussion today. I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, we have Peter Furness, who started the Australian Marriage Equality Lobby in 2004 and who is a same-sex marriage activist. Yes, and we have Patricia Werricoon, who was for a number of years, she directed the graduate program in sexual health at Sydney University. She's very passionate about sex and loves talking about it, so aren't you lucky? And lastly, we have Ian Powell, who works for the City Bible Forum and is an Anglican minister, and who was connected with St Barney's and Broadway for a number of years. So that's who we are. Okay, so just some context on gay marriage in Australia. Obviously, it's a hot topic in Australian politics. Julia Gillard has allowed Labor MPs to have a conscience vote on the matter. Barry O'Farrell has, when it comes to the New South Wales Liberal Party. I'm not too sure yet what Tony Abbott's going to do, even though apparently 80% of Australians would like there to be a conscience vote. Same-sex marriage is legal in a number of countries, including the Netherlands, Belgium, Spain, Canada, South Africa, and so on. It's currently debated in the US and is also a topic that's very contentious in the UK at the moment. According to Julia Gillard, same-sex marriage will be legal at some stage in Australia's. It will be legal sooner rather than later. That's what she believes. And of course, we had the Mardi Gras last Saturday night. The Sydney Morning Herald reported that equality was the message of the Mardi Gras. And Robert, who participated in the parade, said they need to actually make marriage equality for everyone. It's how it should be. So in this context, the opposition of some Christians to same-sex marriage puts Christians out of step with mainstream Australia. And polls indicate that as many as 60% of Australians support same-sex marriage. So it's in this context that we're having this discussion today. I'd like to stress that, this is a discussion. Okay? It's not a debate. We're here to share ideas and to listen to each other, and it's my hope that we can do it very respectfully and with a spirit of generosity. And since we've already had one good run today, I think we'll be fine for the second one as well. So as an opening statement, if we could just get something from each of our panellists. Peter. Okay, so there's two parts to your question. Okay? Firstly, there's opposition to same-sex marriage in various Christian circles, which I just mentioned. So how do you respond to that opposition? And in light of that opposition, do you believe that Jesus would have attended the Mardi Gras?
My experience of Jesus was someone who was very inclusive, mixed with what some people might call all the lowlife, petty criminals, prostitutes. I can't see then why he wouldn't come to Mardi Gras. But I should say, I'm not a person of religious belief. I believe religion is something that humanity has created. You can make a god or gods as you like. So this is an issue for Christians. There are some Christians who would think Jesus would. Of course, there are some Christians who think he wouldn't. That's up for Christians to decide. In respect to the first part of your question, the organisation of which I'm a part receives many emails and letters and phone calls from ministers of religion. Those who identify themselves are overwhelmingly in favour of our cause, are the sort of ministers who would like to conduct same-sex marriages if they were able to in Australia. If they do, they run the risk of losing their ability to conduct any marriages, so they can't. If you believe in freedom of religion, Australia needs to be able to allow those ministers to conduct their religion in accordance with their faith. At the moment, they're prevented from doing so.
Okay, so there is diversity within the Christian community and in terms of this as well.
Absolutely.
Yes. So, Ian, there was an article in the Sydney Morning Herald last week, "I Hugged a Man in His Underwear." A great title. So this is about Christians who went to the Chicago Pride Parade last year, I believe, and they wanted to be an alternative Christian presence at the parade, so they held up placards and wore T-shirts that said, "I'm sorry that Christians have judged you," etc. And one person who was participating in the parade saw that and was very moved by it and ran down to hug one of the people who were part of this group. So the writer says that he ended up hugging this man in his underwear, and he says, "I think Jesus would have hugged him as well." So would Jesus go to the Mardi Gras, and would Jesus have hugged this guy as well? What do you think?
Yes, I'm not sure if I'm turned on electronically. I've got so much electricity here, I just damage electronics. Let me answer the question anyhow, and that is, would Jesus go to the Mardi Gras? I went to the Mardi Gras on Saturday, and I was trying to work that question out as I looked, and there we go. And I was praying and talking with this Christian friend I was with. I think Peter's right to say that, although I'd say it differently, the tendency is for people to make up Jesus in their own image. This has been a long-running problem, which Schweitzer, a scholar 100 years ago, pointed out, that Jesus becomes a symbol of all that we think is good, So whatever we believe to be good, he would do. That's obvious. Instead of actually saying, let me have a look at the Jesus of history, the real Jesus, and work it out. Peter's right, I think, also to say that Jesus, one of the main attacks on Jesus, one of the reasons the religious folk of his day killed him, was, as they said, he is a friend of sinners, which means he's a friend of bankers. It means he's a friend of Anglican ministers, of heterosexuals, homosexual, transgender. I don't think. So would he go there? I don't know if he would have gone there. You know, I saw there were two very clear Christian groups there. One holding similar posters, the ones you mentioned. A group of 5 lovely young Chinese Christians holding up Jesus loves you, John 3:16, and something about I'm sorry for how the church may have hurt you. And then another guy was handing out badly printed tracts about how the judgment is going to burn us all to death. It was interesting trying to work out. But is that too vague?
No, that's a very good answer. Yes. Okay, Patricia. So
Yes.
I think a lot of us think that sexual orientation is quite clear-cut in a way, that you're either gay or you're straight. You know, what does the research, is it as clear-cut as that?
Actually, even the issue of gender isn't that clear-cut. Because when we look at gender, and I'll be really quick here, is that when we look at gender, we talk about gender identity. This is like when I walk up to one of you and say, are you a boy or a girl? You're sort of very clear, I'm a boy or a girl, but maybe you're not. And then we talk of transsexuals and transgender. Then we have what we call biological sex, and that's the way we are anatomically, and that, like male, female, very anatomically complementary in terms of genital. And then we have sexual orientation and sex role. Now, sex orientation is what we're talking about in terms of homosexual and heterosexual. And even there, if you look at the two poles as behavior and brain orientation, homosexual and heterosexual, there is a fluid area. And I have had students who've done research, PhDs, on looking at fluidity. That is, you know, what's your brain doing? How are you behaving? There are people who are in heterosexual marriages and still occasionally have homosexual sort of flings. So it's very fluid.
We'll be actually talking about matters of identity later on in this panel discussion, but thank you for that preview of that. So Peter, we're talking today about gay marriage. If you could just walk us through how the gay community defines marriage, people in the gay community who are in favour of marriage anyway.
I think the views within the gay community on what is marriage are as diverse as in the broader community. People have different views. I might just like to say what my view of marriage is. I originally became involved in the campaign for same-sex marriage, equal marriage, because I was very much concerned with equality, and I wasn't so much concerned with marrying myself. I have a partner of 18 years. At the 13-year mark, we did marry. I attended a marriage in Vancouver, conducted by an Anglican minister of the Diocese of Westminster in Vancouver, where they allow such people to marry. And I was quite moved by the occasion. Knowing this couple were only together for 5 years, I thought, I've been together 13, I can beat that. I asked my partner here in Australia to marry me because, very privately, I wanted to give him that status in my life. It's almost as though it didn't matter if anybody else knew, as long as he knew and I knew that we had that status. Of course, when you tell your mother you're going to get married, when you tell your work colleagues you're going to get married, this whole other big thing suddenly becomes involved, and people give you presents and people make a fuss, and all the pressure comes. But for me, marriage is about giving something to each other. We also know in the gay community in particular, the gay and lesbian community, the older you are, the more likely you are to be opposed to marriage of any kind. There's this view that marriage is perhaps a patriarchal institution, one in which men have power over women, which is to do more with property. It's a heterosexist thing. Why would you want it anyway? If you are much younger, you tend to be very much more supportive of marriage. You think it's a much more equal institution. It's about love and commitment, something you know which is desirable. So I guess those views are probably also held by people in the broader community.
Okay, so but there's also a dimension to do with rights as well, is that right? You mentioned in some ways that you want to give your partner the status of being a husband, let's say, but but can you talk us through the equality discourse?
Well, in every different country, marriage attracts different rights. In Australia, pretty much, with a few notable exceptions, you can just live together for 12 months and you attract rights because your relationship is deemed to be a de facto relationship, whether you know it or not. And this is basically about protecting people. The sort of rights marriage does give you, though, pretty much concern immigration, which are pretty important if one of you is not an Australian. But I think in the Australian context, it's very much more about love, commitment, and a status of kind. Symbolism is very important. Maybe we'll talk more about that later. But,
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. Ian, so we've just heard Peter comment on how, for himself personally, and for many people in the gay community, marriage represents stability, it's an expression of love, it's about commitment, and there also is there is a dimension to do with rights as well. So can you talk us through perhaps how the Christian definition of marriage comments perhaps on these, on the gay marriage, on the gay position? Sorry.
And I'll try and be... because we were chatting in the taxi coming back from North Sydney how we're dealing with huge issues in a few seconds. As a Christian, as I understand, and just using it in the classical sense that I'm committed to Jesus being who he said he is, haven't been persuaded, and therefore I'm seeking to put into practice what he says about human life, I see nothing in the teaching of Jesus or in the rest of the New Testament that indicates that I should try and set up some sort of theocracy in our culture. It's quite clear in the New Testament it's not the job of the church to enforce, what we understand to be right about life on those who don't. Now, at the same time, so the discussion in Australia for me is not so much about a Christian understanding of marriage, because I think what you've got, and I think you can argue this, but I think in almost every culture that we run into, over time and at present, there's a way that humans relate, which we slap the label on marriage. So recently I watched with a friend a documentary on nomads in Mongolia. Couldn't get a place much further away from, Europeanised stuff. But, they're living in their things, mum, dad, kids, and a couple of extended bits, but fundamentally, this is a thing that seems to come out of the nature of being human. And the Australian law has been that Peter and others are rightly in our democratic society seeking to get change, it's a democratic right to have a go at that, is not saying we're Christian, it just identifies a way that humans relate, which they call marriage, and it's about a man and a woman, quite overtly, in an exclusive, permanent relationship. And it's always with the understanding, and the reason why the government takes an interest in marriage in particular is because it's the place in which kids come. That's why Bertrand Russell, who was no friend of Christian morals or Christian belief, says that's why the state has got a rightful interest in marriage, because of what it does in terms of it generates children. And that's what we've called marriage. And it's just that's what it is. Now, when my gay friends quite understandably want to say we'd like some part of that in terms of it being an expression of love, they use the term of equality. I just think that's a mistaken... So I understand it, but I think it's to not understand how marriage works in human culture. And in all sorts of areas, we're concerned about justice. And it's very common, in order to pursue justice between people, you don't treat them the same. So there are all sorts of benefits and privileges our society gives that I'm not able to get. If I was if I was a native born, like if I was an Aboriginal, there are all sorts of things I can get that I and my children can't get. That's fine. During the Second World War, my father was man-powered. He was unable, I don't know why he wanted to, but he was unable to get to the front line because the society said, we need that profession and that profession and that profession to stay at home. And is that equal? Well, no, not really. Is it just and fair and healthy? Yes. And my concern is that you can't oppose love and equality. I think Peter and people running the concerns that they've got have done a good job in framing the debate. Because Australians, if you say it's about equality and love, anyone against those? Well, of course, the debate's over as soon as you have that discussion. But I think we actually need to step back and think a little harder about how this works and whether or not human society is just endlessly malleable, or whether or not there are things that come out of the ecosystem of what it is to be humans together. So I'd take a different position to Peter.
I'd like to invite you to respond.
There are many same-sex couples have or are responsible for raising children for a various number of reasons. As we know from research, and I hate citing research because it's very easy to say that, children of married parents tend to fare better than children of non-married parents. It is unfair on those children not to have the same benefits for stability, for status, often practical rights that comes from having married parents. This equality, this justice is not just actually about the couples involved, it's about our extended families, and in very many cases it's about our children as well.
Patricia?
Yeah, I'll actually quote research. After all, I am a sexologist. Recently out Parkinson's report, which some of you may have seen, actually talks about kids growing up in male, female, married families as turning out healthier and more emotionally balanced. The thing is, I do a lot of lectures with young kids in sexuality, and one of the big things young kids are looking for is a role model. So a young girl is looking for a female role model, and a male is looking for a male role model. And their futures are very much being built, or what we call scripted, by what they are seeing in the adults, the male, female adults. This is one of the reasons we sort of encourage parents to tell the children their stories.
I agree with Peter that there are children who, for all sorts of reasons, finish up being raised by gay couples, and whatever rights they need to be protected, and also the parents too, in case that relationship breaks up, that some parent doesn't get completely excluded from that child that they've cared for. That does need to be looked out for, but I think there are all sorts of kids who, through no fault of their own, finish up in anything other than what you might think is ideal. I think that we're actually talking about marriage, and I think we want to be careful about changing it because of unfortunate events where it doesn't work out as you hope. And I think also this is it feels a bit of a circular argument, Peter, because last year when we had the debate about should gay couples be able to adopt babies, which I thought was a very dishonest argument. The argument was constantly given that there are all these children without homes, which is just rubbish. There's a massive high number of parents wanting to adopt. I thought if you can't run the argument honestly, don't run it. But I think the argument then was, should gay couples be able to adopt these babies? And I think it's hard, and then it's argued in terms of the rights of the adults, which is the first time we've had adoption laws written about the preferences of adults instead of entirely being focused on what is best for the children. So I think we can, as you mentioned at North Sydney, there have been an awful lot of law changes in the last few years which rightly have given some fairness and justice to gay couples in terms of superannuation and stuff like that. I think the needs of the children in those things can be looked at and should be looked after without changing the historic and worldwide understanding of what a marriage is.
Well, I'll just say very quickly about children. Almost all adoptions in Australia which don't involve children coming in from overseas are made by people who have a familial relationship with that child already.
Yes.
This is about couples who are raising children, and they're wanting a woman, for example, wanting the other woman to have, in case something happens to her, for the stability of the children to become the adoptive co-parent. There are also, you'll note, you can pick up occasionally gay newspapers in Sydney, and the New South Wales government is advertising for same-sex couples to foster children. There is a problem with fostering of children, often with special needs, who are a little bit older perhaps and are not being fostered. So if you're a long-term foster parent and then you want to adopt that child and give that child the status of being your child, then of course you should have. And that's not just for you, it's also for the benefit of that child. I don't think there are many adoptions in Australia that are occurring by bringing children in overseas because most other countries don't permit it.
Yes.
Yeah.
I might have to pause that discussion.
That's a different issue.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'd like to remind everyone that you can SMS questions in and we'll try and get to them. I'll just go to one right now. So this is for everyone to comment on if you would like to comment on it. If marriage is open to homosexual relationships, what stops other groups seeking recognition as marriage? For example, polygamists. How about we throw that to you, Peter, first up?
There are certain restrictions in the Marriage Act which relate to such things as age. You have to be a certain age before you can marry. You can't marry people who are of a particular closeness in terms of familial relationships. I'm not sure exactly what they are. You certainly can't marry your brother or sister or your daughter or your mother and father. And there's quite good reasons from a public good why that shouldn't exist, including, I would argue, in terms of being able to marry more than one other person. Being married, you attract certain benefits, so a state has an interest in maybe you can't marry 4 or 5. Nevertheless, in this world, there are a number of countries which legally permit polygamous marriage. All those countries are Islamic countries which have an Islamic law. There are a number of countries which permit same-sex marriage. None of those permit polygamous marriage. These two things are quite contrary. They're not the same thing. If you argue that, you allow same-sex marriage, what next, is this slippery slope argument. Not so long ago in Australia, you got married and a woman's property automatically vested in the man. She didn't have any property. Now that's not something that we would accept now. So that's a change. It's a good change. In 2 states in Australia, if you were an Aborigine, Queensland and Western Australia, you had to apply to the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs to marry. In Queensland, you would only be given permission if you were going to marry another Aborigine. They wanted to keep the race pure. In Western Australia, you would only be given permission if you were going to marry a non-Aborigine. They wanted to breed Aborigines out. Now, that's an offensive thing, that's a change, and we would think that's a good change. Just because something is changing doesn't mean it's going to be bad. When they got rid of these anti-miscegenation laws in the US, which in a number of states, you weren't allowed to marry someone who was not in your race, that's a good thing. The same argument was put. If you allow, and this is by one of the judges who ruled on the case, if you allow people of same-sex marriage to marry, what next? People of the same sex.
I agree with Peter, and you need to be very careful of the slippery slope argument. It can be used to block any change. A lot of changes, like the ones that Peter mentioned, are absolutely good and right. And Bible people, on the whole, certainly in Australia, were absolutely leading the charge on righting the wrongs for Aboriginals. But there are some laws when you change them where you change the whole structure of the system. And I think the concern that some people have, and these are both Christians, atheists, and some gay people, will argue that the problem with when you make the fundamental thing about marriage about equality, it is logically impossible to argue that all sorts of other things that most gay people would not be arguing for and would probably oppose, like many partners. In Switzerland in 2006, there was a serious attempt to get the law changed there so people, brothers and sisters, could have sex, because now sex has been separated from reproduction on the basis of equality. That is, I love her, she loves me, I love him, he loves me. How dare you put you've now got 2 groups who can, but if it's about equality, it is simply a fact that the way our law works is once a precedent is set, it moves. And this is not just a hypothetical, because we can see in the countries that are ahead of us, for better or for worse in this area, that those pushes are coming. And they've been mentioned in Australia. There was a group who were aggrieved, I can never get this word, polyamory, who were aggrieved, and I was reading some of their material, because they were not allowed to have a float with their signs asking for equality this year. And they were saying, how is this possible on this whole thing about equality? Because the major group with the Mardi Gras, now the gay community, realised that would be unhelpful for the community to think more rigorously about changing the law from saying that's just what marriage is, has been, is, let's move it on the basis of equality. So I know I feel like a complete jerk. I don't know Peter well, I like him, my gay friends, but I think in the end we've got to think more about what this ultimately does to the ecology of human society. Where
Yeah, just a quick comment here, that talking about slippery slope type thing. You know, like us in our field, like you know, working on homosexuality and its sort of nurture is kind of like, you know, so researched out. So one of the areas that is now cutting edge research is this area that's being called genetic sexual attraction. And that is trying to find a basis to say that, you know, that parents, a father and a daughter can actually be sexually attracted rather than just a familial attraction. And brother and sister separated at birth, you know, adopted out or something, and then they meet after a long time. There is this attraction that they feel, that if they grew up together, it would have been family, but now it's sexual. So they are looking at genetic sexual attraction. So it sort of says, how far can you push the boundary when it comes to sexual attraction?
I'm interested in your comments about how there might be a basis, a genetic basis for the various impulses, etc., that we have. Now, I just want to we keep that in mind and move the discussion to questions of identity, because I've heard that you've said that you're born sexual, not just you, but everyone. We are born sexual and we will die sexual. So I want to ask you, Patricia, how central is sexuality to identity?
Sexuality is central to every bit of our identity, but I just want to pick on the homosexuality bit of it, sexual orientation. You see, I'm heterosexual, but my heterosexuality isn't my identity. But we find that when it comes to being gay or lesbian, homosexuality is very important in terms of identity. And part of it, we find, is the fact of looking for a community. And now, unfortunately, the church is homosexual, heterosexist, you know, it's like God hates faggots. And so, you know, the point is homosexuals therefore need a community. And churches are not providing community, but you're finding community in places like you giving. And so identity, and therefore for homosexuals, their orientation becomes identity. Of course, we now know that nature and nurture both play a part in this homosexuality debate.
In light of all of this, I know, Ian, you're giving a talk on this in a couple of weeks' time. How can, if someone is gay but also a Christian, how do they reconcile those dual or different aspects of themselves?
Yes, I do have. I have had friends over the years who would say that their sexual orientation and attraction is to people of the same sex, but who are convinced about Jesus as he really is, and so they are confronted by real difficulties. The same, in a sense, not dissimilar from someone who is heterosexual and unmarried who becomes a Christian. They're confronted by this. Are you serious? I cannot express my affection with my genitals, etc., in full sexual union with someone who I'm, unless I get married. And so it's tough. My friends, the people who I know who I know are gay, and I'm sure there are many who I know who I don't know if they're gay or not. I don't go around asking people. Some have decided that they will live without sex, without physical relationships like that, and it's hard. It's hard in a slightly different way, but a not dissimilar way, to friends of mine who are heterosexual and single, and therefore they're not having sex with anyone. Because Jesus places sexual activity, always, he goes back to Genesis 2, between a man and a woman, leaving and cleaving, becoming one flesh. But one or two people I know, they would say that they are now heterosexual. That they've dealt with a number of, for them it was more a question of nurture than nature. And one of them, to his surprise, when he was getting some issues dealt with and found himself having sexual fantasies about women, he said it just was like volts went through him, it shocked him. So I think some seem to, if they get the right sort of care, I know this is almost a heresy to say this in Sydney, seem to change. Others simply say, unfortunately, this is what I am, and I will live chaste until I die, and then all things are restored.